right, so you guys have, many of you have known for a long time, you hear me talk about change and implementing difficult change and using a neuroscience-based approach. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today, just to give you a little bit of a taste beyond the 30 seconds and 20 seconds that we tend to talk about what we do. So what we've noticed in the last 4 or 5 years now, you got COVID going on. We had a lot of disruption in the marketplace. Now we have economic up and down depending upon which country you're in. Are we going to have a recession? Is the economy booming? Some sectors are, laying people off. Others are hiring like crazy. So there's a lot of change going on. And in order to navigate that for our businesses, we also will need to change. The analogy that I've used for a while now, as I'm looking at my clients and how they're dealing with all this turmoil, is I see sort of two extremes. So if you can imagine with all this stuff happening, that it's like there's all kinds of balls up in the air, right? You've got those that are like, oh, I don't want to deal with those. I'm going to wait till this is over. Let me go hide under my desk, and we'll wait for the good old days. And then the other end of the spectrum are those that have said, okay, what the heck? I'm just going to go try to catch all the balls and see how I do. And those are the folks that have done the best during COVID, during these up and down times, because they are being flexible and adaptable and trying to pivot. And all those things require change. So I'm going to first talk about the need to do change, to make a change, and see whether or not this resonates with you guys. Just out of curiosity, I know you're all fabulously loyal Tea Lounge members. Is anybody here because of the topic and having some thoughts about what you need to change up? You can just pop in and holler at me. Oh, she's got everybody muted.
People can unmute themselves if you want them to speak to you.
Anybody have something specific in mind? I'll speak to it. If not, we'll keep on going. Okay. So here's what I would tell you then, is that the good stuff happens when you push outside of your comfort zone. You really cannot implement a change or do things significantly different if you stay in the zone of what you've always done. So the first piece that we have to understand and want to do is to push outside that and push ourselves to try new and different things. I'll give you a second to read Mr. Darwin's quote here. So this is true hundreds of years later. It is proven to be true during COVID and during the up and down economic situation, at least we're seeing in the States. People need to be adaptable. They need to keep evolving themselves in order to survive. So that's what we're going to focus on. You hear me talk a lot about difficult change. So let me define what I mean by that. If something is easy for us to do, it's a tweak. It's adding some new tasks, but we know how to do them. The way we need to change our thinking isn't significant. That would not qualify as difficult change. But let's say that I've been doing something a certain way for a very long time. That would be more difficult. Perhaps there's an emotional component to it. Maybe the way I think about conflict and the way I talk to people has been ingrained in me since I was a kid. And it's very uncomfortable to think about changing that. If it's a big gap in skills or the way I spend my time. So let's say that I've been a solopreneur doing everything on my own for the longest time. And now my business is blown up and I'm going to hire people and I need to delegate and I have to cede control and I need to get things done through other people. That's a big gap in where I was coming from to where I need to be now. So the difficult change that we're talking about are those significant changes. So it turns out there's a big differentiator for folks as it relates to identifying what needs to change and in even success. And this was proven out this is a real life experiment that was done where 2 business owners were found that were in very identical fields. They were roughly the same age. They were in the same part of the country. They had access to equal educational opportunities. They had access to funds, a highly skilled workforce. All of that was pretty dead even. So then they started to test the skill sets of these two folks. And they did the IQ tests, and they were very similar there. The only difference that came about is when they started measuring what we call emotional intelligence skills. And this is where there was one key score that was different, and that was around self-awareness. So 10 years into each of these business owners' journeys, the person with very low self-awareness was struggling. They didn't acknowledge what they weren't good at. They were afraid to hire people that were smarter than them. They didn't bring in outside help, and they were about to go bankrupt. The other business owner had a very high self-awareness score, had no qualms about hiring people that were smarter than her, brought in consultants, learned how to do new things. And in that 10 years, she grew a $1 billion business. So we cannot begin to identify what needs to change without some level of self-awareness. And this is how I define that. So the key words here, the part that I've added is we need to be objective, meaning we're not, putting ourselves down. We're not overvaluing something that a skill set we have, or undervaluing it. And then the really big important thing is without beating yourself up, because the minute you start doing that, you're shutting yourself down to development and growth. So what might be some signs that you might need to implement some change? There are certain words I hear all the time when people come to, talk to me. Stuck is a big one. I'm so stuck, right? I was speaking to a client yesterday where anything that she feels is really difficult, that's going to require a hard conversation or her to make a big decision, she procrastinates on, to the point then that she creates even a bigger issue because she waited too long and she's missed deadlines. People rationalize stuff. They avoid things. I justify my behavior with all kinds of elaborate stories. And sometimes it's about blaming others. So sometimes people that are really struggling or have a low self-worth tend to blame other people all the time. So these are all really big clues that some shifting needs to happen and some growth needs to happen. Another important one is the time frame. So what we know based on neuroscience is that if we are capable of making a change, we will do it in 6 months. So when people say, I have had on my to-do list for 2.5 years that I'm going to stop being in the weeds and I'm going to start thinking more strategically and grow my business, if that's been on your list for 2 years, there's something blocking you from doing that. So this is a good way to start to look at this self-awareness for yourself. Another one is a concept that I like to illustrate with this story. So if you have a kid that you live with, a spouse that you live with, maybe they've left their socks in the middle of the living room floor. And for days you've watched them walk over them and around them like they do not exist. And you say, can you please pick up these socks? And they say, what socks? This phenomenon happens all the time, where something is literally in front of our face, but we've gotten so used to it, or there's something about it that makes us uncomfortable that we no longer see it. And I find this a lot in businesses. It can be about a problem employee. It can be about a client we should get rid of, any number of things, right? But we've blocked it out. So that's another sign, maybe there's some things that need to be changed. And then finally, there's a phenomenon called the amygdala hijack. Some of you may know about this already, but maybe you don't know the name of it, but you've experienced it. But what this is that there's a part of our brain called the amygdala, which processes emotions, and it is where the fight, flight, or fear response resides in our brain. And so if you find that you're constantly in that state, we also call it a lizard brain, right? Where maybe I lose my cool in a meeting. Maybe I shut down in conversation because I'm uncomfortable. Maybe I literally, flee the building when something is overwhelming me. We go to that overwhelming conversation at the beginning. When this is happening, clearly something needs to change. Part of it is because it's uncomfortable, but once our amygdala is fired up, it blocks off access to all the other parts of our brain. So even if I have great problem-solving skills and I can think linearly about what steps need to happen, if I am fired up like this and in amygdala hijack mode, I can't use the rest of my skills. And so this is often something people come to me to help figure out what needs to change because they get in this state all the time. So if we've decided that change is important, we may have also figured out that it's difficult, especially if there's things you've tried to address for a long time. So to illustrate this, imagine that we are watching a kindergarten class and the teacher is trying to describe the concept of colors to kids and to teach them all, the same understanding of what is green and what is red. And perhaps she holds up a red crayon and she spells out the word red and says, these are the letters in red, right? This is what color this tulip is, or this heart. Here's a green crayon. Here's how we spell green. Color the grass and the leaves in your picture green, right? And she's hoping that everybody has that same understanding. Well, imagine there's a colorblind child sitting in that classroom. They're going to be so confused because everything looks brown to them. There's no differentiation. It's literally a blind spot. The same can happen to us as it relates to ways of thinking and skill sets where we have complete blind spots. So instead of talking about colors, imagine when you've gotten feedback where somebody's saying to you, you need to be more authentic in your marketing, Petra Fisher, right? You need to be more flexible. You're way too rigid. Your conversations with others are not empathetic. You really need to learn more empathy. If I am missing these skills, right, or if they're blocked for some reason, emotionally or otherwise, this is equivalent to being colorblind. I won't know what this looks like, and I will have no idea how to do it. So if you've got that kind of a blind spot, right, or something you've been trying to do for a very long time is not happening, this is where that change can become so difficult. So the reason is, there's a reason for it, and it can be very helpful to understand it from a science standpoint. We as human beings are wired to resist. This is how we come out. It's a self-protection method. But obviously, sometimes we need to learn new things. The best way that I can describe this is to imagine that in our part of the country, we have these nor'easters, and we can get 2 or 3 feet of snow, and the winds can howl. You can't see anything. But imagine I need to get to my mailbox because I'm working at home and there's something important there. So I trudge up my very long driveway through the 2 feet of snow. I get my mail, and now I turn around. I'm going to go back in the footsteps, right? Because it's easier. Why would I go through 2 feet of snow again? A similar process happens in our brain. When we experience something a certain way, we're taught it a certain way, we're watching others do it a certain way, we lay down a neural pathway. And once we've laid that down and we've seen it a few times or experienced it a few times, it becomes a very strong path. Let me go back to my nor'easter. It's the second day after. The wind has stopped, but I haven't been plowed yet. And I need to go back out to my mailbox. So I go out the front door and I see that my path was really stupid. Like I'm in my neighbors, I'm in the woods, it's all over the place. Now in my brain, I'm thinking there's a better way to go. Just go up the driveway straight up. It's going to be much shorter. You won't end up in the trees. But now the default is for the brain, it's so much easier to do what we've done before. And the same happens with these behaviors. We can know that a wayward thinking isn't helping us anymore, but doing it differently is difficult because of these neural pathways. So this neuroscience-based approach that I talk about all the time helps us understand what steps to take to basically fill in those footsteps and lay down a new skill set. So we are wired to resist, and this is important to understand. And in my work, we welcome the resistance because there's ways to break through it. And once we've broken through it, we've basically let go of those old ways of thinking and minimized that neural pathway, making room for new ones. So I think it's important to understand some of the common responses to change, though, because this also makes it difficult. And all of this is based on research. So you can listen to these and figure out which one you think is most likely to be your response to change. The first is about 7 to 10% of the population. And as you can tell by this guy, they love change. It's a small percentage of the population, but they were blessed with highly plastic brains. They love to change. They don't need support. They're receptive to it. They love to grow. You could change their job tomorrow and they'd be fine. The next group, which is about 20 to 23% of the population, actually has the ability to change with support. So they have somewhat flexible brains. The key here is they want to understand why. They need to be convinced that it is the right thing to do. But once they have, right? So if this is you and you realize, yep, I really need to change up my presence on LinkedIn. I need to change my pricing. I need to set better boundaries with my clients. Once you've convinced yourself that that is what's good for your business, you'll probably be able to execute without a lot of problems. This next group is the majority of us, 35 to 40% of the population. Really want to change, right? Self-aware, realize I've got these weak things, these weak spots, there's things I got to do differently. However, they get tripped up by those neural pathways. So they cannot make these changes without some help and without going through those steps, and in spite of how much they want to do it. Now we start getting into the more and more resistant gang. So this next group that's 20 to 23% of the population don't want to improve. They don't want to change. You know, if they're working for you, they're going to be like, nope, this is stupid. If you have a tendency to think, but we've always done it this way, it's always worked. That's this part of the population. So you're going to fight it, and you're going to stay in that comfort zone of where you've always been. And this group without help is never going to bust out of the box that I showed you at the beginning. And the final group is, again, a small percentage of the population, but these are the folks that are going to pretend that they want to change. If they work for you, they'll nod their head and say, yeah, sure, no problem. And then they're going to completely sabotage the whole thing. If you personally respond with, you know, you talk and talk and talk about it like that, you want to understand and make those changes, but deep down it's like, nope, nothing's going to change. I'm going to fight this with every fiber of my being. This group, we have a special model for, but we often call this uncoachable. And these are the folks that will go down with the ship. They'll lose a relationship, they'll lose a job, they'll lose their business before they're willing to make any change without help, right? So like I said, there's a way to help these folks if, you know, somebody says you absolutely have to do this, or maybe they finally come to the conclusion, I don't want to lose my business, but they require a very specific process to get past this. So the good news is, though, that as I've been talking about, there's some neuroscience that tells us the brain can change. It used to be that the scientists thought once you get older, you're cooked. There's no way that you're going to learn new things. And we now know that's very different. And again, we have to take a very specific approach, though, to take our brain through certain steps. But I've got people in their 70s who are wanting to craft in a completely new last act for their lives or their careers that completely blow things up and do things differently. So it's possible at any time. So let's talk about the neuroscience piece just for a minute. So I want to help you understand why it's different and how it can be so helpful. Courtesy of Samantha Kempster, you guys might have seen this graphic before in a LinkedIn post, right? But the neuroscience-based diagnostic process is really trying to understand what's actually going on. And all of us as human beings are only aware of about 10% of what's going on in our brain, literally the tip of the iceberg. Where all the action is below the surface, and we're often not aware of it. So by using a neuroscience-based diagnostic process, we can better understand by setting some really deep goals, what's happening at a deeper level, right? So instead of just looking at what's everybody's noticing, I know for sure what's going on. And with some data-driven unbiased assessments, we identify very definitively, here's the core cause, here's what's getting in your way, and here's how we remove it. So this is never about my opinion. And so these are very distinct differences in using any kind of neuroscience-based coaching approach or change management approach if you're talking about a bigger team. A second key concept in a neuroscience approach is what we call overcoming the knowing-doing gap. So if you think back to my example of the footsteps in the snow, right? So as I'm standing there seeing that my path was really bad, I know that's not the right way. My brain knows that's a bad pathway. Just like my brain knows it's not helping me to be conflict avoidant and leave a room every time somebody disagrees with me, right? But doing it differently is where the gap is, right? So this process helps us overcome that, because otherwise those old neural pathways are going to keep calling us back, even though we know I really need to be able to do it this way. So that's one key difference. And another is this idea of unlearning and relearning. Again, you can relate this back to the footsteps in the snow, but many times people need unlearning goals, meaning this is the thing I have to let go of. I sometimes call them instead of goals. So instead of doing this, I want to do this. Instead of overreacting and saying things inappropriately every time somebody makes me angry, I'm going to pause and take a moment, process my emotions, and speak clearly about what I need to happen next. Right? Those are two different worlds. And there's something that's causing me to overreact and lose my ability to have a decent conversation with somebody that I got to let go of before I can learn this new way of doing things. Another way of thinking about this is, imagine that I'm going to paint my office, which is currently a dark color, dark blue, and I'm going to paint it white. And I see that there's some holes in the wall from pictures. There's some greasy handprints that you can easily see, and there's a big crack. If I don't address those things first, I'll go put up that white paint, right? And the crack's going to come show back up again. I'm going to be able to see the blue underneath it. The paint's not going to stick to the greasy handprints. There's more blue, right? And that blue's going to keep coming back. It's the same concept here with skills and ways of thinking. If I don't eliminate the way of thinking that's not working for me, it's going to keep coming back to haunt me, even if I throw another coat of paint on it. So I might learn a new skill, but now they're going to be competing for each other. Okay, so we've identified what difficult change looks like and why we might address it. We understand the differences in a neuroscience-based approach. So now what's next? Now we have to figure out what specifically do we want to work on that needs to change, because this is all about setting the right goals. Because imagine you get in a car, you don't really have a destination, you don't know where you want to go, but you just start driving anyway. And you drive and drive and drive and drive until you run out of gas, and then you end up someplace that you don't want to be. This is what happens if we don't specifically identify where we do want to end up, right? So what are my goals? What are my objectives? What do I want it to look like in 6 months? As part of that, we need to identify what needs to change for ourselves. Again, that's part of that goal setting. So there's a series of questions we ask ourselves during this process around, what's in my way, what's causing me problems, what kind of feedback am I getting, what keeps me up at night. That's the kind of thing we start with and then start honing it down. It's important to understand my philosophy here, which also applies to goal setting, which is never bring a fly swatter if what you really need is a pooper scooper. The tendency is to swat at flies. And people find all these little things and they'll come in with a list of 27 things that I got to do differently or change. They are all related. What we're looking for is what is the commonality between all those niggling little things that are bothering you so that we can remove the root cause, right? We're looking for the smelly pile of, doo-doo. We remove that and all the other stuff goes away. So this is very much about getting to the root of things in the goal setting and in any kind of diagnostic. Another way of thinking about this is imagine that I have the sniffles and a cough and I'm not feeling great, right? It's important to know why that's happening. Otherwise, my doctor won't know what to tell me, right? So if it's a cold, chicken soup maybe ought to do it. However, if I've got the flu, I might want to take Tamiflu to reduce the length of that illness, right? And if God forbid it's something worse, something bigger, that I did this originally before COVID. So now you can throw that in there, right? But I have to know what is causing that cough and that sore throat and the drippy nose, right? Those would be the flies. We want to understand what's that underlying disease. And it's the same for making changes. So when identifying what needs to change, again, a lot of times people tend to see that tip of the iceberg, right? Or those flies. So for example, a lot of people identify that they can't make a decision, right? Tell me what the 5 steps to make a good decision are. So that's a common one. Prioritization. I've lost track of how many times people say, I can't get out of the weeds, right? Every day I have a to-do list. I'm going to work on those bigger things. I'm going to be more strategic. I'm going to build my business. And then at the end of the day, I got all caught up in all the little shit again. Communication, that's a biggie, right? I don't seem to know how to talk to Jane. Whenever I'm in a group, I don't know how to read the room. I can't tell when people are aligned with me or not. Difficult conversations. I get so worked up about having difficult conversations, I just avoid them altogether. And then in general, the inability to execute. That goes back to those crosswords, right? I'm avoiding it, I'm procrastinating, all those things, all right? So these are important observations, but they're not what we actually have to work on. We have to understand what's the next deep level. So for example, we are looking for the real root cause. So for example, it could be maladaptive thinking habits, right? The reason that I'm not actually making a decision is I'm constantly second guessing myself. And gee, if I think about it, I've been doing that since I was a little kid, because my mom always used to say, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure that's the right thing? So that's my neural pathways getting in the way. That's what I'd have to look at. Negative self-talk all the time. This is a biggie, right? So it's not so much about how I prioritize my time or, what I'm doing. It's that constant voice in my head telling me that was a mistake, or what if something goes wrong, or, oh my God, if I talk to my employee about their bad performance, they're going to leave and I can't afford to have anybody leave. And it's a constant loop that just sucks the life out of you. Another potential root cause is a variety of emotional discomfort, lack of skills, right? I'm not paying attention to my emotions. I block them out. If somebody else is expressing emotions, I, need to leave the room. And what we know is that the most effective leaders are not ignoring emotions. They regulate them. They pay attention to them. They listen to what they're telling them. So this is often a root cause. Another can be rigid thinking, very black and white. There's only one right answer. There are some things that we do where that's true, right? It may be that there's only one right part that fits into this bridge that's not going to make the whole thing come down. But when we're talking about interacting with people and clients, rigid thinking is very problematic and can cause all kinds of symptoms. The bottom line is, though, that every individual or a team is going to be unique. So 10 people can come to me and say, I have difficulty with decisions. There's 10 different reasons why and 10 different solutions as to how we're going to help that person. Because we bring a lifetime of thinking habits and the ways we've learned to do things and what's been modeled for us that needs to be taken into account. All right, so we've become very aware of this. We understand that we want to dig as deep as we possibly can, and we're going to set these goals, right? Because we don't want to end up someplace that we don't want to be. So in this sort of goal setting, and from a neuroscience perspective, we have important goals and we have outrageously important goals. Now, an important goal are something you're probably familiar with. They're very significant. They have a consequence on our business. It can be things about, we want to grow our revenue 10%. I need to hire 3 new people. I'm going to implement a more robust marketing strategy, and I'm finally going to put myself out there on LinkedIn. Those are important goals. The outrageously important goal is identifying what's the thing that's going to make the difference. So if I look at those tasks that I've just put in my important goal, if there's any part of that that terrifies me, that I don't think I know how to do, that there's something blocking me from doing it, that's the outrageously important goal that I have to set then, right? So that I can get past that and be comfortable pursuing my important goal. Excuse me. So to figure out an outrageously important goal, there's a bunch of stuff you can ask yourself. You may have a sense already about what you need to learn how to do. What is it that I got to let go of, stop doing that unlearning thing? What keeps me up at night? There might be areas that you need to grow or change, in the way that you're thinking or how you're doing things. And again, what's going to get in the way, right? So if I know that fear constantly gets in my way, it impacts my decision making. It impacts whether I hire somebody. It's everywhere. That's the thing you have to then have an outrageously important goal about. I often ask people to think, what do you want it to look like in 6 months? And then you start to look at the gap from where you are now, and that can drive a lot of the goal setting. These are just some ideas to look at, right? Because really a lot of what we're talking about are behaviors, right? The stuff that's getting in the way of executing on tasks are behaviors and ways of thinking. So this is just a smattering of them. And you can see how, these would be a shift potentially for some folks. Being more reactive or less reactive about things. Those are the ones that are kind of blowing up all the time. A lot of people don't have the confidence that they need to do something really different with their business or their career. So any of these, and there's, endless behaviors and ways of thinking that might show up for you as you think about this. The other thing I want to show you, looking at my time, is really quickly that sometimes you have to dig even deeper around some of these things. So like for flexibility, right? Let's say I've been told I'm really rigid and therefore I need to be more flexible. Well, what does that mean, right? And does that feel like a blind spot? I might need to understand what other behaviors feed into flexibility. For example, self-control. People that measure highly flexible on assessments also have a high level of self-control. They have a high IQ so that they can assess things very fluidly. They're open to lots of input. And finally, they trust themselves, right? So if I have everything but the trusting myself, right? If I'm always fearful that I'm going to screw something up, I'm going to have a hard time adapting and being more flexible about things. So these are ways to dig in a little deeper again. Okay, so if you've got an idea of how you want, what kind of goals you want to set, here's the best way to do these. And again, there's a neuroscience reason for doing this. I want you to visualize that new behavior or what you want it to look like. I often ask people to kind of think 6 to 12 months ahead. But now what you want to do is pretend you're watching yourself through a camera. This allows us to dig a little bit deeper. What am I doing? Who am I interacting with? How am I speaking to people? Have I hired new people? What kind of clients am I interacting with? The The more you can visualize it, the better. Because next, what you're going to do is describe what that looks like really vividly, right? So if I want to be able to walk into a room more confidently instead of sort of shirking at the side, and I'm going to make a presentation, I'm going to envision myself walking in confidently, shaking people's hands, and taking my position at the head of the table to do a kick-ass sales presentation. And then finally, we want to write it down. And I know people hardly ever use paper and pencil anymore, but this is very helpful from a science standpoint because we're going to tap into a different part of the brain when we're actually writing it down versus typing it. So that becomes an important step. All right, I want to really quickly just give you one example of these, and I want to make sure that there's time for some questions. So let's show what this looks like, right? So this was a client who had established those important goals around boundaries for themselves. They wanted to establish them, communicate them, and honor them. Because right now they were letting clients run all over them. They were getting calls on Saturday nights. It was a problem for them. So if you think about this conversation about digging deeper, you know, what might get in the way? For this person, it was a lack of confidence, a fear of losing clients, and an avoidance of uncomfortable conversations. So you can imagine if this wasn't mastered first, you're never going to get this done here. So here was one of the goals that we crafted for her. I'll let you read that quickly. So you can see you start to change the wording. These are all about what I will do or what I want. And it's very vivid, right? You understand what it's going to look like going forward. Here's another one, just to give you some practice. This client wanted to implement a price increase, improve the profitability, and only take on ideal clients. And what she was doing right now is basically over-delivering. She had incredibly high standards. She was giving people more than what they asked for, and then wasn't able to charge for it. So what was in her way was that she was undervaluing her experience and expertise in spite of the fact that she was considered an expert in the state in her field. She was giving away services due to her own emotional baggage around what it was, because the law that she practiced was one that was important to her in her own family. And she was doing a lot of assuming instead of asking about what clients wanted. So again, those are the outrageously important goals that she has to do first, these things, before you're going to be successful implementing these. I'll let you read her, one of her goals. That really puts it out there, doesn't it? All right, so I'm going to skip to my last page here. We won't do this client impact story. Okay, so to summarize, if you feel like you do need to deal with some difficult change, first and foremost, you want to understand that you will resist and accept it, right? Understand where it's coming from. And the more you can embrace that putting this change in place is going to be uncomfortable, the easier you will be able to bust through it. You want to set these goals by visualizing the changes you're going to make, right? What do I want it to look like in the future? Describe it very specifically and write them down. And include in your goal setting 1 to 3 outrageously important behavioral goals, right? That's that stuff I've got to shift first in order to get everything else done. All right, thanks for your rapt attention. I will take questions now.